The Galactic Council labeled humans beasts, until the hunt turned on them. The first thing Ambassador Yara Osei noticed about the Galactic Council chamber was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant exactly. More like old paper soaked in rain, organic, layered, ancient. The conclave hall on Vethra Station had been built 3,000 years before humanity learned to smelt iron, and it showed. The walls curved inward like the inside of a shell, ribbed with bioluminescent veins that pulsed slowly, rhythmically, the way a sleeping creature breathes. Delegations from 47 species occupied tiered platforms arranged in a rough spiral, each level slightly higher than the last, each civilization seat calibrated by a complex formula of age, territorial reach, and what the council called demonstrated restraint, a metric Yara had learned that humans scored poorly on. She sat alone at the lowest tier. That was intentional. She understood that. The Veth, who served as permanent arbiters of council proceedings, communicated through color shifts in their translucent skin, a language that required 3 separate translators working in relay to render into something approximating English. The lead translator, a synthetic intelligence humans had built and the council had reluctantly permitted inside the chamber, spoke in Yara's earpiece with a flat, careful voice. The council has completed its review of the expansion incident at Kepler 442. Yara kept her face still. The expansion incident. That was what they were calling it. What had actually happened at Kepler 442 was this. A human mining consortium, operating under a charter that had been, by every reading of existing interstellar law, entirely legal, had begun resource extraction on the 4th moon of a gas giant in a system the Tharaki sovereignty had claimed as a spiritual preserve. The Tharaki had sent a vessel to warn them off. The human crew who had not been informed the system held any special status, had responded by trying to open communications. The Tharaki vessel, interpreting the communications attempt as an aggressive maneuver. Their biology made them hypersensitive to directed energy of any kind, including radio waves, had fired. The human ship had fired back. 3 Tharaki were dead. 14 humans were dead. The moon was still being mined because the consortium hadn't received orders to stop and their communication array had been damaged in the exchange. The council did not see this as a tragedy shared between 2 confused parties. The council finds that the actions of Terran nationals at Kepler 442 constitute a pattern 3 territorial aggression under the Vethra Accords, the translator continued. In conjunction with the 14 prior incidents logged against Terran entities over the past 60 years of provisional membership, the council has voted to formally reclassify the Terran species. Yara's breath was steady. She had been briefed on the possible outcomes. She had been told to expect this. Her government had run models. Humanity is hereby reclassified from provisional civilized member to category Gamma, uncontrolled predator species. The chamber didn't erupt. There was no drama. The bioluminescent veins in the walls pulsed a slightly different color, something the translator identified as collective relief, and the delegation simply adjusted their postures in the small ways that indicated a settled matter. Yara activated her microphone. Ambassador Osei, the translator said with a faint note of surprise. She wasn't supposed to speak. Gamma-class species didn't address the council. They were addressed. I would like to formally note, she said, keeping her voice level and her hands flat on the table in front of her, that humanity does not recognize this classification. We note it exists. We note its implications. But I want the record to show that we consider this a political act, not a scientific one, and we will respond to it accordingly. The Veth arbiters pulsed with something the translator hesitated over for 3 full seconds before offering. Mild amusement. One of the senior delegates, a Keth Vorin, their body like a column of dark water held in tension by some invisible force, leaned toward its communication array. The translator rendered its words with the same careful flatness it gave everything. The Terran representative speaks as though her classification changes her nature. It does not. The classification reflects what you are. We have simply chosen finally to be honest about it. What we are, Yara said, is new here. There's a difference. The Yarundi were new here once, the Keth Vorin replied. They learned restraint or they ceased to exist. The distinction was their choice to make. It is now yours. The session was closed. Yara was escorted from the chamber by 2 Veth security drones, not hostile, just present, the way you might walk a large dog on a leash even if it had never bitten anyone. She walked through the curving corridors of Vethra Station, past delegations from species humanity had never met and might never speak to properly, past wall panels that displayed council records going back to before Rome was a village on a muddy river, and she thought about what the Keth Vorin had said. The Yarundi learned restraint or they ceased to exist. She pulled up the Yarundi file on her tablet. It was thin. 3 pages. A species from a binary star system in what humans called Sector 7. Apex-level intelligence, early space travel, rapid expansion, 37 border conflicts in their first 2 centuries of contact. The file ended with a single line, species status, unresolved. Last confirmed contact, 1,847 years prior. Yara put her tablet away. She found a window, an actual viewport, rare on a station this old, and looked out at the stars. From here, Sol was invisible. Earth was a rumor. Humanity was 312 ships, 6 colonies, 11 billion people on one fragile planet, and a seat at a table where every other species had just voted, quietly and with great satisfaction, to treat them as an animal. She thought about the Yarundi. She thought about what ceased to exist actually meant when a galactic council decided you weren't worth the diplomatic effort of keeping alive. Then she pulled out her secured comm unit and began composing a message to the Secretary General. It was a long message. It was very carefully worded. It said essentially one thing. We have a problem. And I don't think the council understands what kind of problem they've just created for themselves. She sent it, watched the transmission indicator confirm delivery, and remained at the window for a long time. The stars didn't care, of course. They never did. But she found them steadying. Humanity had looked at those same stars from the bottom of a gravity well for 100,000 years and imagined monsters in the dark between them. It turned out the monsters had paperwork. And the paperwork had just made a mistake. The classification came with consequences that unfolded slowly the way a debt does, not all at once but in small, compounding increments that eventually add up to something impossible to ignore. Dr. Samir Reyes learned about the first consequence from a supply manifest. He was the chief medical officer aboard Endurance, one of humanity's 6 deep space research stations, positioned in the outer reaches of the Cauldron Nebula for a 3-year observation mission. Endurance was not a military vessel. It carried 41 scientists, a crew of 22, 2 mediators certified by the old provisional member protocols, and enough consumables for 36 months, provided the quarterly resupply runs arrived on schedule. The manifest for the Q7 resupply had been received 2 days ago. Samir had been reading it carefully because Q7 was when they expected a shipment of isotope-stabilized compounds needed for 3 of the ongoing experiments. The compounds weren't on the manifest. Neither was the resupply ship. The manifest was a cancellation notice. Under the revised trade protocols associated with Category Gamma classification, commercial entities operating under Council licensing were no longer permitted to provide material support to Gamma species vessels operating in Council-adjacent space. Endurance was in Council-adjacent space. Their fuel reserves, he now realized, were calculated on the assumption of a resupply that wasn't coming. He brought this to Captain Adiz Nwosu at 0600. She was already awake, which told him she'd been told before he had and hadn't slept. How long do we have? She asked. On current consumption, about 19 months. If we reduce non-essential systems and trim the heating margin in the outer research bays, maybe 23. Transit time home? 14 months if we leave now. 22 if we wait until the gravitational window in Q9. Nwosu was quiet for a long moment. She was a tall woman from Lagos, 3rd-generation astronaut, the kind of person who processed hard news by becoming very still. So we leave now, we get home with 5 months of reserves. We wait, we're gambling. Yes. And the experiments? Samir looked at the table. The Cauldron observation mission had been 15 years in planning. The data they were collecting, on stellar nursery dynamics, on the formation of complex organic molecules in high radiation environments, was the kind of data that might, someday, explain things. How life started. What conditions it needed. Maybe, at the far edge of extrapolation, where else it might exist and what it might look like. We'd lose about 60% of the primary dataset, he said. The long baseline measurements especially. Nwosu nodded once. We leave at 0800. That was the first consequence. The second came 3 weeks later when Endurance attempted to file a course alteration notice with the Vethra Navigation Coordination Service. A bureaucratic formality, the kind of thing that took 4 minutes and was done automatically by the ship systems. The VNCS rejected the filing. Gamma-class vessels were not eligible for navigation coordination services. They were advised to operate in designated transit corridors, the coordinates for which were available upon formal request to the Council's Gamma Management Division. Captain Nwosu requested the coordinates. The response came 11 days later. It listed 17 transit corridors, all of them longer than the direct route home, 3 of them passing through systems with active mining disputes, one of them going inexplicably through a region the Council's own charts marked as a navigation hazard due to an unstable pulsar. Nwosu looked at the corridors for a long time. Then she plotted the direct route home, filed nothing and flew it anyway. She was not alone in this. Across the next 6 months, as the practical implications of the Gamma classification spread through human space, a pattern emerged that the Council's analysts noted with something that translated loosely as concern. Humans were not complying with the new protocols. Not in an organized, defiant way. There was no coordinated resistance, no declaration, no political movement with a name. It was more diffuse than that. Humans were simply continuing to do the things they had been doing, filing the paperwork they had always filed, flying the routes they had always flown, and when the new systems rejected their filings or blocked their routes, they were making alternative arrangements that happened to achieve the same outcomes through slightly different technical means. A Kethvoran analyst named Sarath-7, whose specialty was behavioral modeling of newly contacted species, wrote a report about this that circulated in the upper levels of the Council. The Terran response to classification is unlike prior Gamma-class species, the report noted. Previous Gamma classifications have produced one of 2 behavioral outcomes: withdrawal and isolation, or escalating conflict leading to containment. The Terrans are exhibiting neither. They are exhibiting what our models do not have a category for: systematic non-acknowledgement. They appear to understand their situation fully and have decided, collectively and without apparent coordination, simply not to accept it. This is not defiance in the conventional sense. They are not fighting the classification. They are ignoring it in ways that are individually legal, difficult to address, and cumulatively effective. The report ended with a recommendation for further monitoring. What the report did not include, because Sarath-7's models were not designed to track this kind of variable, was what was happening in the informal spaces. The message boards, the late-night radio conversations between ships, the long discussions in the common rooms of stations and colonies where humans were processing what it meant to be told by the rest of the inhabited galaxy that they were beasts. Some people were angry. That was expected. But more people were something else. Something that didn't translate cleanly into the emotional vocabulary of species who had never had to fight their way up from prey animals, who had never had to stand at the edge of a dark wood and decide whether to run or hold their ground. They were paying attention. They were watching how the Council worked, its pressure points, its internal disagreements, the 17 species that had voted against the Gamma classification and been outvoted. They were cataloging the corridors they weren't supposed to use and learning which patrol schedules left them unmonitored. They were running the numbers on their own resource independence and calculating, with the kind of patient, incremental precision that humans applied to any engineering problem, exactly how long it would take to stop needing what the Council could take away. In a small office on Earth's moon, a woman named Dr. Keiko Tanaka was leading a team that had been quietly working for 3 years on closed-loop life support systems. The project had been moderately funded, moderately noticed, the kind of basic research that institutions support because it might someday matter. After the classification, its budget quadrupled overnight. Nobody announced why. Nobody needed to. The Veth called it the Continuum of Wisdom, which was their way of saying library. It occupied 17 levels of Vethra Station's eastern ring and contained records going back 400,000 years. Not continuously, not without gaps, but with the kind of depth that made human history feel like a footnote on a footnote. It was open to all Council members above provisional status. It was technically close to Gamma-class species. Dr. Nia Asanti had been a Council-accredited xenohistorian under the old provisional classification. She had been working in the archive for 2 years when the reclassification came through. Her access credentials had been revoked within 48 hours. She had, in that 48-hour window, downloaded everything she legally could, and she had been reading it ever since. The document that changed her understanding, not just of humanity's situation but of the Council itself, was a records fragment from a species called the Orith. They didn't exist anymore. The Council's public records listed them as dissolved, which was the bureaucratic term for a civilization that had ended without war. Absorbed, perhaps, or simply stopped reproducing, or lost something essential that couldn't be recovered. The Orith records were incomplete, damaged, and had clearly been edited at some point by parties the metadata didn't identify. But enough survived to tell a story. The Orith had been roughly analogous to humanity in their early contact period. Fast-moving, expansionist, curious, occasionally violent in ways that alarmed their neighbors. They had been classified as Gamma-class species approximately 300 years into their Council membership. Unlike the Yarundi, they hadn't disappeared quickly. They had survived for another 600 years under the classification, slowly, steadily marginalized. Trade restrictions. Navigation limits. A gradual tightening of the boundaries within which they were permitted to operate. The records didn't show any single moment of extinction. They just showed a species getting smaller and smaller, fewer ships, fewer colonies, fewer records filed, until there was nothing left to record. Nia read those records 3 times. Then she wrote a paper. She didn't try to publish it through any council-affiliated journal, because she no longer had that access. She published it through a small Earth-based academic network, sent copies to every xeno-diplomat and government science advisor she could reach, and titled it with a sentence that would be quoted in policy documents for decades afterward. The gamma classification is not a legal status. It is a mechanism of managed decline. The paper argued, with meticulous citation of ORITH records and statistical modeling of 12 other historical gamma classifications, that the category had never once functioned as its stated purpose intended. Its stated purpose was to provide a framework for bringing aggressive species into compliance with council norms. Its actual function, demonstrated across every historical case Nia could find, was to isolate a species economically and diplomatically until it either broke, becoming genuinely dangerous and providing justification for harsher action, or atrophied. The council, Nia argued, did not want humanity to become civilized. It wanted humanity to become small. The paper reached Ambassador Yara Osei on a Tuesday morning. She read it in 40 minutes. Then she read it again. Then she forwarded it to the Secretary General with a single line of commentary. "This is what they're actually doing to us. We need to decide what we're going to do about it." The Secretary General read the paper and called an emergency session of the UN Security Council's Space Affairs Committee. The committee met for 6 hours and emerged with no public statement, which was for that committee the equivalent of screaming. In the council itself, news that the paper existed reached the Kethvoran delegation within 2 weeks. The senior Kethvoran delegate, the same one who had spoken to Yara in the chamber, reviewed it with the help of 3 analysts. Its response was recorded in internal council communications. "The Terran academic has identified the pattern correctly," it wrote. "This is not a security concern. All gamma species have eventually identified the pattern. Identification does not change outcomes. The pattern works regardless of whether the subject understands it." It was a rational assessment. It was also, in a way that the Kethvoran's pattern recognition systems were not designed to catch, precisely wrong. Because the ORITH had identified the pattern too. They had identified it and despaired of it, had written records that dripped with a particular quality of grief that Nia had found almost unbearable to read, the grief of a people who understood what was happening to them and believed there was nothing to be done. Humanity read the same pattern and started taking notes. There was a difference. It was subtle. It was biological, maybe, rooted in something about the specific way humans had climbed out of the dark, what they had learned in 100,000 years of being outweighed and outclawed and still somehow surviving. The ORITH records showed a species that, when faced with a system designed to diminish them, had tried to appeal to the system's mercy. Humanity had no particular faith in the mercy of systems. What they had was something the Council's behavioral models genuinely did not account for, because no other species in its member roster had needed it in the same way. They had the habit of building workarounds. Not dramatically. Not heroically. With the same unhurried, practical energy that humans brought to plumbing and tax law and the design of tools. The simple, unromantic conviction that if a door was closed, the correct response was to look for another door, and if there wasn't one, to check whether the wall was structural. In 6 research labs on 3 different worlds, teams that had been working on independent resource systems, long-range propulsion and closed-cycle agriculture were quietly reorganizing around a new shared objective that nobody had officially named yet, but that everybody in those labs understood. Stop needing the Council's permission to exist. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a declaration. It was engineering. The Council, watching its monitoring reports on Terran behavior, saw increased scientific activity and noted it as a likely response to status anxiety, a common gamma-class behavior seeking status compensation through technological achievement. They were not wrong about the behavior. They were wrong about what it meant. The Council's decision to send a compliance delegation to Earth was framed, in official communications, as a routine procedural step. Under Vethra Accord Article 7, gamma-class species with active territorial holdings were subject to periodic review of those holdings to ensure they did not exceed the limits set for their classification. Humanity had 6 colonies. The Accord allowed gamma species a maximum of 3. The other 3 were, technically, in violation. The compliance delegation arrived in the Sol system 14 months after the classification. It consisted of 7 vessels, not warships technically but built to the same structural specifications, carrying the same drive systems, fitted with what the Council called compliance enforcement arrays and what any honest reading of the specs would call weapons. They were crewed by a mix of species, but the command structure was Kethvoran. The Kethvoran had been administering gamma compliance operations for 900 years. They were very good at it. Fleet Admiral Jiho Quan watched them decelerate into the outer system from the Bridge of Sol, the flagship of Earth's Defense Coordination Fleet. Earth's Defense Coordination Fleet was, in Council terms, not supposed to exist. Gamma-class species were not permitted standing military forces. What humanity had instead was the Earth Protection Initiative, which was technically a coordinated emergency response and civil protection organization, which happened to operate heavily armed spacecraft in coordinated formations under a unified command structure. The distinction was considered, in Council circles, to be a transparent fiction. Humanity maintained it anyway. Quan had 31 ships. The compliance delegation had 7. The delegation's lead vessel, Arbiter of Accord, opened a communication channel as it completed its deceleration burn. The message was automated, a standard compliance approach protocol, the kind of thing sent to dozens of Gamma-class species over 9 centuries, so routine it didn't require a live operator. Terran entities, you are advised that a Council compliance delegation has entered your system for the purpose of conducting an Article 7 review. You are required to provide navigational clearance for inspection of your colonial holdings. Non-compliance will be noted in your species record and may result in escalated enforcement measures. Please confirm receipt of this message. Quan confirmed receipt. Then he opened a general channel, not encrypted, not directed at the delegation specifically, just open, broadcasting on every frequency the Council's ships were monitoring. Compliance delegation, this is Fleet Admiral Jiho Quan of the Earth Protection Initiative. Welcome to the Sol System. We ask that you hold your current position while we coordinate an appropriate response to your arrival. You are in no danger. Please maintain your current heading and we'll have someone out to meet you shortly. There was a pause. From the delegation's perspective, this was not the expected response. The expected response was either an immediate flight path clearance or a hostile posture that would justify escalated enforcement. We will hold position for 40 minutes, the delegation replied. After which we will proceed to your inner system on standard approach. Understood, Quan said. That should be plenty of time. He muted the channel and looked at his tactical officer. Get me Ambassador Osei. Yara Osei was at that moment in a secure conference room at UN headquarters in Geneva, in the middle of a call with the foreign ministers of 43 nations. She had been in that meeting for 3 hours. She picked up Quan's call immediately. They're here, he said. I know. How many? 7. Armament. Compliance arrays. Equivalent to about mid-range destroyers by our rating system. Yara was quiet for a moment. And ours? 31. Better distributed. Better positioned. Pause. I want to be clear that I'm not recommending engagement. Good. Because we're not engaging. She paused again and he could hear her thinking, that particular quality of silence that meant she was running through options, checking load-bearing assumptions, looking for the door in the wall. What we're doing is hosting a visit. Make sure they understand that. How do I make them understand that? Send them a welcome package. Full navigational data, approach vectors, a list of hospitality facilities on the station. Make it thorough. Make it the kind of thing that takes time to process. Quan understood. How much time? Enough for the Secretary General's address to go out. The Secretary General's address had been prepared 3 months ago, against this possibility. It went out simultaneously on every communication channel available to humanity, directed not at Earth's population but at the Council, specifically at the 17 species that had voted against the Gamma classification. It was a simple message. It didn't threaten. It didn't plead. It laid out, in clear and carefully sourced terms, the history of the Gamma classification, the fate of previous Gamma-class species, and the steps humanity had taken and was continuing to take to ensure its own survival. It included Nia Asante's paper. It included the Orith records. It included a statistical projection of what Earth's resource independence would look like in 12 years if current development trajectories continued. And then it said, very simply, we would prefer to resolve this diplomatically. We are reaching out to all Council members who share concerns about the current direction of Gamma management policy. We believe there is a better path. We are asking formally for your assistance in finding it. The delegation waited 40 minutes, then began its approach. Quan's 31 ships held position, polite and present, neither attacking nor retreating, while the Arbiter of Accord and its escorts moved toward inner system, and passed, one by one, through a corridor lined on both sides by Earth vessels that were not, technically, a military force, watching with sensors that were not, technically, targeting systems. The delegation commander, a Kethvoran officer named Vetharis who had conducted 11 prior compliance operations without incident, filed a report that evening that included a single line that would later be studied extensively by Council analysts. "I do not believe the Terrans are afraid of us." The Secretary General's address produced something no Council analyst had predicted: a response. Not from the Kethvoran. Not from the Veth Arbiters. Not from any of the dominant species whose consensus had driven the Gamma classification. It came from a species called the Mirren. The Mirren were small, their homeworld had a gravity slightly lower than Earth's, and the species it had produced were slight, large-eyed, with nervous systems calibrated for a world where the primary predators were atmospheric rather than terrestrial. They moved through Council politics with the careful, sideways motion of creatures that had learned, long ago, to be overlooked. Their delegation on Vethra Station occupied a small suite on the middle tiers, their voting record was consistent but quiet, and they had been members of the Council for 800 years without ever making anyone particularly uncomfortable. They had voted against the Gamma classification. Their ambassador, a Mirren named Selviroth, had been the first to do so, had, in fact, stood during the vote and delivered a short speech that had been noted in the record but largely ignored, in which they argued that humanity's behavior pattern did not match the clinical definition of Gamma-class aggression, that the Kepler 442 incident was clearly a case of mutual misunderstanding, and that classification should require a higher evidential standard. Selviroth had been ignored. Now they sent a private message to Ambassador Osei, through a channel that was technically legal, technically private, and technically not a violation of the new protocols governing Gamma species communications with Council members. The message was short. "You have read the Orith records. We knew the Orith. We would like to speak with you." Yara spent 4 hours deciding whether to respond. The risk was real. The Council could interpret unauthorized diplomatic contact as a violation of Gamma management protocol and use it as justification for stronger action. But Nia's paper had made clear what stronger action looked like in the long run. She responded. The conversation that followed, conducted over 6 encrypted sessions spread across 2 months, was the beginning of what would later be called the Mirren Channel, a quiet, unofficial diplomatic backroad that connected humanity to the 17 species who had voted against the classification. Not all 17 were willing participants. Some responded to initial contact and went quiet. Some responded with sympathy but not action. But 8 of them, over those 2 months, committed to something that had no formal name but that functioned as an informal coalition. They began asking questions in Council sessions. Not aggressive questions. Not accusatory ones. Small procedural questions, the kind that required the Council to consult its own records and precedents, that forced clarifications and created delay. When the compliance delegation filed its Article 7 report recommending the reduction of humanity's colonial holdings from 6 to 3, it was the Mirren delegation that formally requested a review period under Council Rule 41, a provision that allowed any Council member to call for a 90-day deliberation before compliance recommendations were enacted. The request was granted. It was a minor procedural right, one that had been used occasionally for far smaller matters. The Kethvoran noted it without particular alarm. 90 days was not a significant delay. They did not know what humanity was going to do with 90 days. Dr. Keiko Tanaka had been working for 3 years on closed-loop life support. Her team had, in those 90 days, with a budget that had grown significantly and a sense of urgency that clarified every engineering decision, produced a working prototype of a system that could sustain a colony of 500 people indefinitely, drawing on local resources, with zero external supply dependency. It was not perfect. It would need another year of refinement. But it worked. The day after the prototype's first successful test cycle, Tanaka sent a data package to the teams at all 6 existing colonies and the 3 proposed colony sites that had been put on hold after the classification. The message attached to it said simply, "Build this first. Everything else follows." Meanwhile, in the outer system, something else was happening. The Long-Range Propulsion Team, a joint project between the European Space Agency, the Indian Space Research Organization, and a private consortium headquartered in Nairobi, had been working on what they were calling a phase drift drive. The physics were borrowed from Council science that humanity had accessed in its provisional member period, modified with approximately 30 years of human engineering, and the result was a drive system that didn't require the Vethra navigation corridors that humanity had just been restricted from using. It required something else. A brief, calculated passage through a region of space that Council cartography marked as unnavigable due to gravitational shear effects near a particular class of neutron star. Human navigators, using different models and a different risk calculus, had been running test flights into that region for 8 months. It was navigable. Barely. Under specific conditions at specific times, with a very precise approach vector that had taken 31 test flights to develop. The 32nd test flight made it through cleanly. The Council's monitoring stations in the outer system detected the test but didn't flag it as significant. Experimental navigation was categorized as low-priority gamma-class behavior, another status-seeking maneuver, not worth detailed analysis. The Council's analysts had a model for what gamma-class species did when frightened. They didn't have a model for what humans did when cornered. When cornered, humans stopped looking for exits. They started making their own. The compliance delegation had been in the Sol system for 4 months when Vetharist requested a formal meeting with Fleet Admiral Quan. This was unusual. Compliance delegations did not typically engage in direct dialogue with Gamma-class military representatives. The protocols categorized such engagement as inadvertent legitimization of Gamma-class authority structures. But Vetharist was a pragmatic officer, and 4 months of watching humanity not behave like any prior Gamma-class species had left them with questions that their protocols didn't provide answers for. The meeting took place aboard a neutral platform, an old commercial way station in Earth's L4 point, civilian, cramped, smelling of machine oil and recycled atmosphere. Vetharist arrived with 2 aides. Quan arrived alone. They sat across a table designed for species shorter than either of them and spent a moment simply looking at each other. "You're not afraid," Vetharist said. Their translator was better than most, less formal, slightly more willing to find colloquial equivalents. "Not of you," Quan said. "Not specifically. Compliance operations produce fear responses in Gamma-class species. It is a universal response in our experience. What do you usually do after the fear response?" Vetharist studied him. "We proceed with enforcement." "And does that fix the problem?" "The underlying problem, I mean. The behavior you're trying to change." Pause. "Our mandate is compliance, not rehabilitation." "Right." Quan folded his hands on the table. "Here's my question for you. Not a diplomatic question, just a real one between 2 military officers who've been sitting in the same star system for 4 months. Do you think this is working?" Vetharist was quiet for a long time. "I think," the Kethvoran officer said carefully, "that I have conducted 11 prior compliance operations and that I have some experience with outcomes. And I think the Council sent me here expecting a specific set of possible responses from your species. I have not observed any of those responses." Quan nodded slowly. "What have you observed?" Vetharist looked at the table. "I have observed a species that understood they were being watched, and instead of hiding what they were doing, worked faster." Pause. "I have observed navigational test flights into a region that the Council classified as impassable. I have observed colonial infrastructure being modified in ways that do not appear to serve any military purpose, but that our analysts have been unable to fully characterize." Another pause longer. "I have observed diplomatic communications between your species and several Council members that we cannot fully monitor." "None of that is a violation," Quan said. "No," Vetharist agreed. "None of it is. So what does the Council do now?" The Kethvoran officer looked at him with something that the translator rendered, after a hesitation, as uncertain. It was a quality Quan suspected was not common on Vetharist's face. "I have filed a report," Vetharist said. "I have recommended that the Council reconsider the classification." Quan kept his expression neutral. "What was the response?" "The report was received. No action has been taken." Quan nodded. "Thank you for telling me that." "I did not tell you to be generous," Vetharist said. "I told you because I have been conducting compliance operations for 40 years, and I have seen species make mistakes in both directions. I have seen species that did not understand their situation. I believe you understand yours very well." Pause. "I wanted to know if you understood mine." Quan looked at the Kethvoran officer for a long moment. "Your situation is that you were sent here to enforce a policy that isn't working by an authority that won't change the policy, and you have to make a decision about what your professional obligations require you to do." Vetharist was still for several seconds. "Yes," they said. "I can't tell you what to do," Quan said. "But for whatever it's worth, from one officer to another, the species I know best, when faced with a situation like yours, tends to find that its first obligation is to the thing it was actually supposed to protect. Not the policy. The thing behind the policy." He stood. Extended his hand, the human gesture, which Vetherists studied for a moment before slowly extending their own. The physical contact was brief. The understanding it represented was not. 3 days later, Vetherist filed a second report. This one was longer. It included a detailed assessment of Terran capabilities, not the capabilities the Council's models had been using, based on humanity's status at the time of classification, but an updated assessment based on 4 months of direct observation. It included the navigational test data. It included the colonial infrastructure modifications. It included Nia Asante's paper, with a 3-page analysis arguing that the Council's own historical record supported its central thesis. The report was classified and distributed to the Senior Council. It was the kind of report that, in the history of the Council's management of Gamma-class species, had never been filed before. It said, in the measured language of a career compliance officer, "We are not managing a frightened animal. We are managing a species that is calmly preparing to not need us. If we continue the current approach, in 10 years we will have neither compliance nor leverage. We will have a neighbor who owes us nothing and remembers everything." The Council convened an emergency session. Yara Osei was not invited. But the Mirren ambassador was. And the Mirren ambassador brought 6 others. And for the first time since the classification, the question being debated in the chamber was not what to do about humanity. It was what humanity was going to do about them. The reclassification hearing took place on a Tuesday, which Yara had always found a slightly absurd detail, that the event her government had spent 2 years working toward, that had kept her awake more nights than she could count, that had reorganized the diplomatic priorities of 11 billion people, happened on a Tuesday, in the same curved shell chamber where the original classification had been delivered, with the same bioluminescent light pulsing its slow rhythms through the walls. She sat at the same low-tier seat she had occupied before. This time she was not alone. Selviroth of the Mirren sat in the observation gallery. 7 other ambassadors from the coalition species sat with them. They had no formal role in the proceedings. Their presence was itself the statement. The session had been called by the Veth arbiters under Council Rule 88, a provision for review of classification decisions when significant new information had been presented. Vetherist's report had constituted significant new information. The Mirren coalition's sustained procedural pressure had forced acknowledgement of that fact. The Secretary-General's address, which had by now been formally received and read into the Council record by 3 separate member species, had established the Orith parallel as a matter of official historical context. None of this guaranteed anything. Yara knew that. The Kethvoran still controlled the voting mathematics. The Council's conservative bloc had spent 2,000 years calibrating its grip on these proceedings and didn't loosen it easily. But the calculus had shifted. Vetherist's report had done something that all of humanity's engineering and diplomacy couldn't have achieved directly. It had introduced doubt into the Council's own professional infrastructure. The Kethvoran lead delegate opened the session. The Council is convened under Rule 88 to review the Gamma classification of the Terran species, it said. Ambassador Osei, you have been provided formal speaking rights for this session. You may address the Council. Yara stood. She had written and rewritten this address 17 times. The final version was 4 minutes long. She had timed it. She had read it to her team and watched their faces and revised the parts that didn't land. She had read it to her mother, who had listened and said quietly that it was good. She spoke without notes. 2 years ago, she said, I stood in this chamber and told you that humanity considered this classification a political act. I want to clarify what I meant. I didn't mean it was made in bad faith. I think most of you believed you were doing the right thing. I think the Council, over 3,000 years, has built a system it genuinely believes promotes stability. I understand the logic. A young, fast-moving species with a high aggression index and limited diplomatic experience, that is a legitimate concern. The Kepler 442 incident was real. The prior incidents were real. What I meant was that the classification was a choice. Not an inevitable conclusion from the evidence. A choice about what kind of relationship you wanted with us. You chose managed decline. You have made that choice before with other species and it has worked in the sense that the problem eventually went away. Those species got smaller and quieter and eventually the record just stops. I want to be honest with you about what we are and about what we are not. We are not the Yarundi. We are not the Orith. We have read their records. We know how this ends if we accept the terms you have set. We will not accept those terms. I want to be clear about that, not as a threat but as a fact that I think deserves to be named plainly. Humanity will not become small. We are not built for it. I don't say that with pride. I say it the same way I would say that water is not built for remaining still. It is simply what we are. But here is what we also are. We are 11 billion people who want to be part of something larger than ourselves. We are a species that, in the last 100 years, has had to confront the worst of what we are capable of, the violence, the tribalism, the capacity for cruelty, and has, imperfectly, with enormous difficulty and at enormous cost, chosen differently. We are not finished with that work. We will not be finished for a long time. We are asking you to let us continue it. Not under managed decline. Not in corridors you assign us and budgets you control. As members, with the obligations that membership requires and the standing that it grants. If you are afraid of what we will do with that standing, I understand. Our record gives you reason for caution. I'm not asking you to trust us because we deserve it. I'm asking you to trust us because the alternative is a relationship that ends the same way it always ends, and because there is, sitting in this chamber today, enough information to know that we will not let it end that way quietly. We would rather build something with you. But we are prepared to build it anyway. She sat down. The chamber was quiet in the particular way that large spaces full of thinking beings are quiet. Not empty but held. The vote took 3 hours. The Kethvoran bloc held. 12 species voted against reclassification. That was expected. What was not expected, what Yara had estimated at perhaps a 30% probability, based on 6 months of backchannel intelligence, was the size of the coalition that voted in favor. 22 species. Enough for a majority. The Veth arbiters pulsed a color that the translator identified, after a moment's processing, as something between surprise and precedent. The reclassification passed. Humanity was reinstated to provisional member status, with a stipulated 2-year review period and a set of agreed conditions regarding the disputed colonies. The conditions were not perfect. 2 of the 6 colonies would remain under restricted development status for 18 months. There were monitoring requirements. There were reporting obligations that felt, if Yara was being truthful with herself, somewhat infantilizing. She signed the agreement anyway. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Selviroth stopped her. The Miran ambassador was smaller than she was, large-eyed, moving with that characteristic sideways caution that 800 years of council politics had not fully erased. You changed the math, Selviroth said. We tried to, Yara said. Not by fighting. That is what surprised them. You changed the math without fighting. Yara thought about Vetheris' report. About Keiko Tanaka's prototype running its test cycle in a lab outside Nairobi. About 32 navigation test flights into a region the council had labeled impassable. About Nia Asante reading Orith records until she understood them well enough to write a paper that forced the council to look at its own history. We fought, she said. Just not the way they expected. Selviroth considered that. We voted for you, they said, because the Miran have been small in this council for a very long time. We know what managed decline looks like from the inside. We were not going to watch it happen to another species if there was something we could do. Thank you, Yara said. I mean that. Do not thank us, Selviroth said, with something that might have been gentle humor. Become the thing that makes the vote worth casting. Yara flew home 3 days later. From the porthole of the transit shuttle, she watched Vethra Station recede, that ancient curving structure with its bioluminescent veins, its 3,000 years of politics and precedent, its records of species that had risen and fallen and been filed away under tidy categories. She thought about the Orith records. She thought about that thin file, 3 pages, ending in a single line. She thought about what it would take to make sure that, 1,000 years from now, humanity's file was full. Messy and complicated and contested and long, full of arguments and revisions and evidence of a species that had kept going, kept building, kept insisting on being present and counted and real. Not managed. Not contained. Not small. Just there. Stubbornly, productively, exasperatingly there. The station vanished from view. The stars spread out ahead. Yara opened her tablet and began drafting the next communication to the Secretary General. There was still work to do. There was always work to do. That, she had come to understand, was not a burden. That was the whole point.